Heartburn is something almost all of us have felt at some point. It is that annoying burning sensation that rises through your chest after a heavy meal or a late night. For Patricia Bell, a 71-year-old woman who had spent her entire life taking care of others, heartburn was an old acquaintance. She had lived with acid reflux for years. She knew exactly what it felt like when the acid flared up, or at least, that is what she believed. I am Dr. Michael, and today, I want you to join me on a journey through one of the most critical nights in Patricia's life. This is not just a story about a hospital. It is a lesson in how the human body, and specifically a woman's heart, can whisper signals of death while we try to rationalize them as simple daily discomforts. If you are over 60, or if you have someone in your life over that age, I beg you to listen to every word of this story. Because what Patricia ignored almost cost her her very last breath. It was the night of Tuesday, April 11th, in the year 2024. The air in Patricia's home smelled like roasted chicken with rosemary and steamed vegetables. A light, healthy dinner, nothing that should have caused a major problem. Patricia finished her plate, stood up calmly, and helped her husband Robert clear the table. Everything seemed normal. However, exactly 30 minutes after taking her last bite, a burning sensation began to grow in the center of her chest. Patricia sighed with annoyance. She thought perhaps the seasoning on the chicken had disagreed with her. She walked to the kitchen cabinet, took the bottle of antacids she had kept for months, and chewed 2 tablets, hoping for immediate relief. But 10 minutes passed, and the fire in her chest did not recede. Instead, it began to transform into something else. It wasn't just burning anymore. It was a subtle pressure, as if someone were pressing their palm firmly right behind her breastbone. She took 2 more tablets, 4 in total. But her body did not respond. Robert, who was reading on the sofa, looked up and noticed something strange. Patricia's skin, usually rosy and full of life, had turned gray. Tiny drops of cold sweat began to glisten on her forehead, even though the house was cool. "Honey, you don't look well," Robert said, his voice heavy with concern. Patricia, with that protective stubbornness common to many mothers and grandmothers, tried to smile. "It's just the food, Robert. Don't overreact. Give me a few minutes and it will pass." But Robert did not feel at ease. He remembered a documentary we had published weeks earlier about atypical symptoms in women. He knew that women don't always feel that movie-style pain that makes you drop to the floor clutching your left arm. Robert walked over and asked her, "Does anything else hurt?" Patricia admitted, almost with embarrassment, that she felt a strange nausea, a hollowness in her stomach that wasn't hunger, and a bothersome tension rising through her neck to her left jaw. "It feels like I've been clenching my teeth too hard," she confessed. In that moment, Robert knew there was no time to lose. He ignored his wife's protests, grabbed the car keys, and helped her up. Patricia kept saying it was foolish, that she didn't want to bother the doctors or spend hours in a waiting room for simple indigestion. But Robert was firm. "I'd rather apologize for a false alarm than cry because I didn't act," he told her as he closed the front door. They didn't know it then, but Patricia was less than an hour away from her heart stopping forever. When they walked through the emergency room doors at 7:45 that evening, Patricia could barely stand. The cold sweat now soaked her blouse, and her breathing had become short and shallow. I was finishing a review of another patient's chart when the triage nurse called me urgently. "Dr. Michael, we have a 71-year-old female. She says it's heartburn, but her pulse is weak and she is extremely pale." I rushed to cubicle number 2. Patricia was lying back, her eyes half closed. Despite her condition, when she saw me, she tried to apologize for being there. "I'm sorry, doctor. I'm sure it's just the chicken from dinner." I took her hand. It was freezing. I asked her about that jaw pain, and she confirmed that now it felt like a massive weight was pulling her ears downward. I ordered an EKG immediately. We couldn't wait for blood tests. In less than 2 minutes, the technician had the electrodes placed on Patricia's chest, arms, and legs. The machine began to print that grid paper with lines that looked like mountains and valleys. My eyes fixed on leads 2, 3, and AVF. There was the enemy, a clear and dangerous ST segment elevation. "Patricia, listen to me closely," I said, squeezing her hand to keep her focused. "You don't have heartburn. You are having an acute myocardial infarction. Your heart is telling us that one of its main arteries is closed." Her eyes widened in terror. "A heart attack? But my arm doesn't hurt. I just feel tired." That is the great deception, my friends. The heart of a woman over 60 does not always scream with crushing pain. Sometimes, due to age and conditions like diabetes, the nerves do not transmit pain the same way they do in a younger man. The body confuses the signals. The brain receives the distress signal from the heart, but interprets it as if it were coming from the stomach or the jaw. It is what we call referred pain. We activated the heart attack protocol. The hospital transformed into a choreography of urgency. We administered chewed aspirin to try to thin any clots, clopidogrel to keep platelets from grouping further, and heparin to keep the blood as fluid as possible. Robert watched from the hallway, hands clasped, praying in silence. He had done his part. Now it was up to us. At 8:30 in the evening, Patricia was moved to the cath lab. It is a cold room, filled with monitors and bright lights, looking like something out of a science fiction movie. Dr. Rodriguez, our interventional cardiologist, was already prepared. Patricia was conscious but sedated. We needed her to be calm while we navigated the interior of her arteries. Dr. Rodriguez made a small puncture in her right wrist. He introduced a thin, flexible tube called a catheter. Under real-time X-ray guidance, he moved up through the arm, reached the shoulder, and finally entered the aorta, the great highway of blood leaving the heart. The moment of truth arrived when we injected the contrast dye, a special liquid that glows under X-rays. On the monitor, we saw something that chilled our blood. The left anterior descending artery, known worldwide among doctors as the Widowmaker, was practically dead. A 95% blockage was preventing oxygen from reaching the front part of the heart. That artery is the one that supplies most of the energy to the heart muscle. If that blockage had reached 100% before she reached the hospital, Patricia would have suffered sudden death. "We are going to open it now," Dr. Rodriguez whispered. With millimeter precision, he passed a wire as thin as a hair through the blockage. Then, he advanced a tiny deflated balloon. When it was in the center of the obstruction, he inflated it to a very high pressure. On the monitor, we saw the plaque of fat and calcium, accumulated over decades, being crushed against the artery walls. But the balloon is not enough. We needed a stent, a small metal mesh, like a tiny scaffold, to keep the artery open permanently. Once the stent was in place, we injected the contrast again. It was a beautiful sight. The blood flowed back, like a rushing river, flooding the heart tissue that was on the verge of dying. On the operating table, Patricia took a deep breath. Color returned to her lips almost instantaneously. "Doctor, the weight is gone," she said, her voice much stronger. "I can breathe again." 5 days passed before Patricia could sit up in her bed to talk to me before going home. She was connected to a monitor showing a stable, strong heart rhythm. Robert was by her side, never letting go of her hand for a second. Patricia looked at me and asked the question many ask. "How could I have been so blind, doctor?" "You weren't blind, Patricia," I replied. "You simply didn't know the secret language of your heart." I took that moment to explain to her, and now to all of you, the 3 critical signals that saved her life thanks to Robert's insistence. The first signal: that heartburn that does not respond to medication. If you take an antacid, and 30 minutes later, the discomfort remains the same, or gets worse, listen to me closely. That is not your stomach. Heart cells, when deprived of oxygen, release chemicals that irritate nearby nerves. Since those nerves pass near the esophagus, the brain gets confused. Please, if the antacid fails, think of your heart. The second signal, the combination of nausea and cold sweats. This is not the flu. When the heart is in crisis, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response. This causes the body to divert blood toward vital organs and away from the skin and digestive system. The result is that ghostly pallor, the freezing sweat, and the urge to vomit. In a woman over 60, this is a heart attack until proven otherwise. And the third signal referred pain in the jaw or neck. The nerves from the heart and the nerves from the jaw enter the spinal cord through the same path. It is like crossed wires in a telephone exchange. The brain feels the pain up in the face when the true emergency is down in the chest. Patricia listened intently, nodding. She promised me she would never again say she didn't want to be a bother. The embarrassment of going to the ER for nothing is insignificant compared to the pain of leaving an empty chair at the Christmas table. 6 months have passed since that April night. Just a few days ago, Patricia came to my office for a routine checkup. She did not look like the same gray, weak woman who entered the emergency room. She had lost weight, her eyes sparkled, and she walked with an energy she hadn't had since her 60s. She told me she is now a leader at her senior center. She doesn't let any of her friends ignore a suspicious symptom. In fact, she confessed that a month ago she accompanied her friend Mary to the hospital because Mary felt a strange pain in her back after dinner. It turned out to be unstable angina. Patricia, by sharing her story, has already begun saving lives indirectly. Her heart now functions at 60% capacity, which is nearly normal for her age. The stent is in place, protecting that artery that almost became her grave. Patricia learned that life doesn't end at 70. It is renewed when we learn to respect our bodies. If you have made it this far, I ask you not to keep this information to yourself. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep learning with Dr. Michael about how to protect those you love. Like this video so it reaches more women who today might be feeling a dangerous heartburn. And above all, comment. Have you ever felt something you thought was nothing and it turned out to be serious? Your experience might be the signal someone needs to act today. Remember, the hearts of those we love don't always scream. Sometimes they only whisper. And learning to listen to that whisper is the greatest act of love we can perform. Choose life. Recognize the signals. Act immediately. Because time does not forgive, but knowledge saves lives.